Robin Hood Radio and the Robin Hood Radio Network is proud to present Leonard Lopate at Large, lively hour-long in-depth discussions providing overviews and context to topics usually covered in partial measures. His guests include leading thinkers, scientists, artists, economists, farmers, historians, authors, and politicians. Mr. Lopate is a Peabody Award winner whose numerous honors include 3 Associated Press Awards and 3 James Beard Awards.
Welcome to Leonard Lopate at Large. I'm Leonard Lopate. Congress has been cutting the budget of the Internal Revenue Service since 2011. Many taxpayers have benefited as a result, while others have suffered immensely. In Who's More Likely to Be Audited, a person making $20,000 or someone making $400,000, an article published in ProPublica last month, investigative journalists Paul Keil and Jesse Eisinger describe how a combination of too few IRS resources and a Congress bent on ensuring that benefits meant for the working poor aren't being abused is making life miserable for the most vulnerable in our society. Paul Keil covers business and the economy for ProPublica, reporting on the foreclosure crisis, consumer debt, and other financial issues. Jesse Eisinger is a Pulitzer Prize-winning senior reporter and editor at ProPublica and the author of, and I can't say the full title of the book, The Chicken Blank Club, Why the Justice Department Fails to Prosecute Executives. I'm very pleased to welcome Paul Keil and Jesse Eisinger to our show now. Hi.
Hi, thanks for having us.
And Jesse,
I
guess you weren't planning to talk about your book on the air because we can't say that word.
I know. I thought it was a great marketing device to not be able to tell the title of the book. Somehow got bad advice that way.
Paul, what's the Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC?
It's one of our largest anti-poverty programs, which is something I think most people don't know, that it's administered through the IRS.
Enacted during the Johnson war.
Yeah, it goes back,
poverty?
I think, the 1970s is when it first started to be put forward as an alternative to welfare. And the attraction to people on the right and the left was that it was aid that was going to people who were working, and therefore was kind of a counter to arguments against giving aid to the quote-unquote undeserving poor.
So it was conceived as a kind of a work bonus for low-income wage earners?
In its first iteration, that's the language that was used. It'll give you earn money working, and we're going to give you a little more because of that.
An alternative to welfare.
Right.
Milton Friedman championed it. So it was really kind of the genesis was on the right as a response to the war on poverty, LBJ programs.
And who qualifies for the EITC?
It's targeted right now at low-income families, and by low-income, I mean the typical recipient earns under $20,000 a year, which is really low income. People who up into $30,000, households with income up to close to $40,000 can still get it, but it starts to phase out after a certain point. But it's really targeted to low-income people who are working, who have children.
And I was surprised by how many people qualify. 28 million in 2017. That's a lot of people working for very little money.
Right, and that's households. So you're talking about people in terms of the children. You're talking about many millions more than that. So one measure is that it takes around 5 million kids out of poverty every year.
And how much money is spent annually on the program?
It's around $70 billion,
wow.
Which is a lot of money. But
you know how many walls you could build with that?
Exactly. I don't do the math right now. But there's been all sorts of studies by economists. Economists tend to love it as a way of helping the poor because it's very targeted. And there's all sorts of studies that showing that it helps health outcomes. Basically all the money is spent because of who it's going to. So it's a very efficient form of aid. In any low-income area, you can see the effects of this in terms of people catching up on car payments and, all sorts of things around February, March when this aid goes out.
Paul, who's Natasha Smick?
She was.
I should have asked you, Jesse. I would get you in this conversation.
Oh, well, yeah, no. Paul's the one who talked to her, so it's fine for Paul to answer that one.
Sure. She was someone who was audited this year, and actually that's one thing we set out to do was find people going through this experience. So auditing the EITC has been a major emphasis for the IRS going back really to the 90s, and that's because, and we can talk about why this is, but the short version is that there's some evidence that some of it goes to the wrong people who don't technically qualify.
They're afraid that people are taking advantage of the EITC?
That is so. Yes, but the reasons for why there might be aid going to the wrong people are somewhat complicated. It tends to get flattened to fraud as an explanation, which actually is not the predominant explanation. But so Natasha Smith is someone who claimed it, like these 27 million other households. She's got 2 young children. Both of her and her husband, she worked part of the year. Her husband worked full of the year. He's a cook. They earned around $30,000. If you look at their situation, they are not the type of household that you would expect to be attempting to defraud the government. There's basically no risk factors there, which is one thing that I found notable about the fact that she's got audited. But what happens when you get audited is you don't get your refund. And then you have to prove to the IRS typically that you earned what you earned and that your kids are your kids. And the thing that everyone talks about is if you have a 3-year-old or 4-year-old, you have to find documentation that says this 4-year-old lived in at my address during this year. And so that sends low-income people rooting around for some piece of paper that will say that, little Bobby lived in my address.
Obviously, the kid didn't receive mail, so you can't.
Right, yes.
Right.
They're not getting an electric bill.
The rules about who qualifies are incredibly complex. And one legal aid lawyer told you, Paul, that her third-year law students often can't figure out who qualifies, who doesn't. So they've made the bureaucratic red tape involved in this program extremely onerous.
How did you learn about Natasha Smith?
We actually did a call-out. We were trying to find people. I found it easier to find people who are going through this process through attorneys, people had managed to find their way to attorneys, but most people don't find their way to attorneys. And so we actually did a call-out, said, like, have you been going through this? And she was someone who was going through it right now, which was a great kind of example for us to talk about.
So did she expected a $2,000 refund from the IRS for her
EITC.
2017 taxes? Did she ever receive it?
She's not received it yet. So, and that's just the EITC
and that's
portion.
on a family that earned $33,000 for the year.
So it's a big amount of money. She's struggling. She's going to school. In addition to taking care of kids, she's got bills. She said she was behind on credit card bills, and she was hoping to use that money to catch up on her credit card bills. So when this money doesn't come, it's really disruptive to people.
And Jesse, as you said, the IRS told Ms. Smith that she had 30 days to provide supporting documentation. And as she understood it, she needed to prove that she and her husband had earned what they said they earned, and that their child was their child. Did she send the IRS all the things it was asking for?
She was complying with all that the IRS was requesting and going through the process, but then there were these added delays because of the budget cuts. And so, which we're obviously going to get to in a second. But so one of the consequences of the budget cuts is that there's been this stepped up enforcement of the EITC, and the IRS is more careful about it. And one of the most important aspects of our story is that as a proportion of its overall audits, the IRS is doing more audits of the poor, the working poor, than it is of the affluent now.
Even though you would assume that if somebody who was cheating on his taxes, let's say Donald Trump's father, as the New York Times reports, the amount of money that they would get back would be so much more than if they audited 10,000 of these people.
Right. So the wealthy, of course, are where the money is. So that's where you should be auditing. Now, as the audit rate of the wealthy is still higher than the audit rates of the less wealthy
and by
the
wealthy,
poor.
People who earn more than $1 million a year.
Right.
That's where you finally get to.
Right, the extremely wealthy. But actually, what we found is that two really important things. One is that the audit rate of the wealthy has gone down much more quickly than the audit rate of the poor. So they've disproportionately put resources into, or kept resources into, auditing the poor. The second thing is now the audit rate of the affluent, where we're sort of calling $400 $100,000 to $500,000 in income, which is very affluent, wealthy people, but not super wealthy, they're actually audited at a lower rate than the working poor now, which is pretty shocking.
Is it that to some degree because the IRS also is trying to save money? If they audit wealthy people, then they're very likely going to have to deal with lawsuits and all sorts of other things.
Right. So there's all sorts of reasons why auditing the poor is so much easier than auditing the rich. First, these audits are heavily automated. So like for Natasha and anyone else that goes through this experience, they get a letter in the mail saying you're being audited. And it's because some computer has decided that there's something fishy about her return, but it's not really clear what that issue is when you get the letter. You're just told you need to support this and this and this and this. And the delay is, so they can send out, there's more than 300,000 of these audits they did last year. It's a mass-produced sort of audit system. The problem is when these people raise their hand and say, actually, I do deserve this credit, I do qualify, and they send their documentation, and that's when someone needs to look at it. So that's why there's a massive backlog at that point. If you're going to audit a rich person, you need a highly trained auditor who's going to put hours in on the front end of figuring out what is that if there's a problem, what the problem is, and so that audit just doesn't get done if that person's not working there.
But there's
so
also
the SMICs were told that it would take another 6 months for a review.
Right. So
but you say they still haven't received.
So she applied in January of last year. She's still waiting for her refund.
But to add to what Paul just said is this doesn't take place in a political vacuum. And what has happened over the years is that the Republicans have hammered the IRS about EITC, quote unquote fraud, and so they've kind of relentlessly kind of raised the issue of whether the IRS is policing this area enough and whether there's fraud and whether the poor are taking advantage of this program. And so the IRS, in response to this, has not stripped away the resources from this kind of policing when they've been so under the gun for so much else.
Well, when we're talking about the case of the SMICs, $33,000 earned, $2,000 returned, even if there was some fraud involved, we're talking about very little money as far as the big picture is concerned.
Exactly. It's an infinitesimally small number for the federal government and an incredibly important amount for them.
And how do families that apply for the EITC count on their refunds to make ends meet?
Yeah, it's amazingly important for everyone who applies. And as I've said before, so the last area that I covered was bankruptcy, and part of bankruptcy filings swell every spring, every February, March. Those are the highest levels for bankruptcy. It's because people get their tax refunds, and if you're low,
and they can afford
to file because they can afford to pay an attorney.
Yeah,
because that's one of them. That's the big upfront cost for filing for bankruptcy. So any financially stressed household, this is like an enormous amount of money to them. I mean, like I said, the typical recipient is under $20,000 in income, and you're talking about 10% of their income they're getting at one time, and and oftentimes they've been planning with the expectation that I want to keep up on my apartment, my rent, but I'll let my car slide because I know I got 3 months and I can pay it when the refund comes back.
And what were the ramifications for the SMIC family as a result of the delay?
Well, her credit cards are in collections. I think she's fortunate enough to have been able to move in with her parents, but not everyone is that fortunate.
And she called the IRS to find out why it was taking so long, and they told her that there was nothing they could do because they just didn't have the staff.
Yeah, so it's like I said, it's on the front end, the computers can send out letters, but when people want to say, wait a minute, that's when a human being has to take a look at it, and that's where the huge backlog is.
The Wall Street Journal reported, I think today or yesterday, that there'll be further delays if the government shutdown, stalemate shutdown continues. The IRS is going to be even more short-staffed. During the shutdown, the IRS doesn't perform audits or offer assistance to taxpayers who are asking questions. And the agency is currently working with 12.5% of its workforce.
Right. And I think is what the Journal also reported is that refunds will not go out, but they'll take payments in.
Right.
Which is, I mean, if that keeps up, that's
Refunds won't go out for anybody, rich
Right.
or poor.
Right. And this, of course, is the crucial year because the only major legislative accomplishment of the Trump administration, of course, is passing the tax overhaul. And people don't really understand what their true tax bills will be because they haven't experienced filing in a full year with the tax law in effect. So people don't understand what the effect of the lack of SALT, state and local deductions, will be. Most people don't understand that they don't longer have to itemize their deductions. This is going to be an enormous mess, and there's estimates that millions and millions of Americans have been under withheld, so they're going to owe taxes. So the fact that we have the IRS now shut down with the rest of the government is going to only exacerbate all these problems.
My guests on Leonard Lopate at Large today on WBAI New York 99.5 FM are Jesse Eisinger and Paul Keil, and their article, Who's More Likely to Be Audited, a Person Making $20,000 or Someone Making $400,000, was published in ProPublica last month. I imagine that some things actually have changed because tax code changed a bit with the new year.
Yeah, well, I mean, the area of EITC is not the biggest change, but what it has done is made it's provided a whole new area of loopholes that can be exploited for the rich. Like there's a big tax cut for people who happen to have a business that's a pass through where the income passes through to them. Corporations got a massive tax cut, but I think particularly, and then the IRS is weakened. Like we said, they've lost enforcement staff, which tends to impact rich taxpayers more than the poor taxpayers who are audited, en masse by computers. So, I mean, that's gonna be a big mess, I think.
It's very basic and goes without saying, but when you pass a law, then of course there are agencies that have to administer the law, so they have to come up with all sorts of rules and guidelines to govern that. And the IRS has been swamped with this enormous task of trying to identify what the rules and the laws are, what the rules are and what the law means, and that takes person hours and that takes personnel, and so they've been just overwhelmed with the amount of work that working with the Treasury to try to define this law, and they haven't finished yet.
And as I said, now they're back to 12.5% of their workforce because of the government shutdown. The article points out that budget cuts have crippled the IRS over the past 8 years, and that enforcement staff has dropped by a third. So does that mean that the budget cuts began under President Obama? Did he institute them?
No. The Republican Congress did. And as you can remember, there were a lot of fights about the budget, and there were budget compromises, and the Obama administration and the Democrats didn't put up much of a fight on the IRS budget. The IRS budget at certain points was victim of the overall budget cuts. So there was something called the sequestration, if you recall, which was sort of across-the-board giant cuts.
But the IRS is what collects the money that pays for everything.
Yes. Well, so Obama's appointee said, who was a corporate fix-it artist named John Koskinen, he went to Congress and he said, in all my years of corporations working with companies, I've never seen anybody try to cut the revenue-producing arm of the business. The IRS pays for itself many times over. It's an extremely efficient operation, and for every $1 enforcement, there's probably $10 that comes in. For every $1 that the IRS spends in general, about $4 comes in.
So what was the justification given for the cuts?
Yeah, so we do you want to do the history?
Sure, I love the history. I mean, it was there were multiple justifications. So the Republic, sort of casting your mind back a while, there was a kind of bipartisan consensus that the IRS was needed to be fully funded, but that kind of changed in the 1990s, where the Republicans started to attack the IRS and call for its abolishment. And they really did attack it in the 90s. We can get into some of that history if you're interested. In the when the Tea Party Congress comes in 2010 and starts in 2011, they attacked it right away. One, because they have this sort of ethos of wanting to abolish it, but also because
They want to abolish the IRS?
they want to abolish the IRS. Yeah. The idea is that you would replace it either with some kind of flat tax or some kind of consumption tax, sales tax, value added tax. Now,
Which is what European countries do to some degree, although they also have income taxes.
they also have income taxes. Exactly. You could theoretically have a consumption tax if you also had an income tax, but a lot of income is not. A lot of spending is not from consumption, so you have to have a capital gains tax. Most economists think you have to have a capital gains tax, an estate tax. Of course, that's very controversial in right-wing circles. But the other thing was that the Republican Congress was adamantly opposed to the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. And what's poorly understood about Obamacare is it's essentially a tax reform bill. It's a act that is it's got an enormous amount of administration by the IRS, not just the mandate but other provisions. So they wanted to do a kind of end run around not being able to repeal the ACA by gutting the IRS's budget so that it wouldn't be able to enforce or implement the ACA. And they explicitly said that many times.
So that's and you start in 2011. That's one of the main reasons that they're going after the IRS is to attack the ACA, and they say this explicitly, and they try to tie funding, try to prevent the IRS from spending money on that.
But the president had to sign those laws,
right? So the bright line for Democrats was they wouldn't agree to anything that didn't allow them to spend money in the ACA, but they're having all these battles about everything, and it's pretty clear that this was not a hill that they're going to die on in terms of money for the IRS. So the budget was slashed through. There's these wars that went on between Obama and House Republicans. They shut down the government, and a big kind of deal they struck in 2013 is they cut everything by 5%. And then right after that happens, there's this scandal that explodes with Lois Lerner over how the IRS is treating nonprofits. So this was I guess I'll just lay out the allegation and then we can talk about why it's not true. But the idea was that the IRS was specifically targeting right-leaning groups, particularly like groups affiliated with the Tea Party, for extra scrutiny and delaying their applications for tax-exempt status. And
churches that were also becoming political,
right?
That were tax exempt.
It was mostly like these groups like 501c4s, kind of that are the IRS's job is supposed to look at these groups, and there are certain rules about how politically active they can be, and the IRS took some shortcuts and trying to identify groups because they were overwhelmed with the number of applications. And so House Republicans, really seized on this issue and used it as a justification for cutting the budget. And so the next big, this becomes like an issue that completely overwhelms the IRS, becomes a huge scandal for them for the next couple of years.
Hearings, multiple hearings about this, and accusations that the Obama administration has politicized the IRS, like Richard Nixon had.
Right, they're trying to referrals for criminal investigation and all this stuff. And then, and House Republicans are angry that they say they're not getting enough cooperation. They start punishing the IRS for, I guess, not playing along with the investigation as much as they would have liked, or that's the stated reason at least. And so there's further cuts. There's another massive cut in 2015, actually in the middle of the year, that caused the commissioner told us he thought about, do I have to send everybody home for a week or something like that, because they didn't have a budget. And what they ended up doing was not hiring as many seasonal employees. There's people who come in during tax season to answer the phones, and they just didn't hire as many people. And that year, only a third of the phone calls into the IRS were actually answered. So that's kind of, these are the major issues that were the rationale for the cuts.
It was really a pretext, or it was really disingenuous, because even if you granted that the tax exempt group was targeting right-wing groups, which ended up not really being true, it's a tiny portion of what the overall IRS does. And so you're crippling the rest of the tax enforcement and collection regime just to go after this tiny little operation out of Cincinnati.
Which was based on law.
Which, of course, was based on law, and in fact, they should be doing that. And if they were disproportionately flooded with right-wing groups or left-wing groups in a right-wing, in a Republican administration, they should scrutinize those groups too. I mean, we want an IRS that polices tax-exempt organizations and secret political organizations from exploiting the tax-exempt status.
So
in an ideal world,
the number of audits has fallen. Has it fallen equally for both the rich and the poor?
So what we found, well, the audit rate is down about 40% in the last 8 years. So it's fallen faster for the richest than it has for the poorest. The poorest have been the most resistant to those cuts, and I think that's a reflection of, one, they have this political pressure to do these audits of people who receive the credit, and also, like I said, it takes skilled personnel to even start an audit of a rich person, and that's where you see that drop.
And you write that for people who apply for the EITC, the audit rate has fallen less steeply and the process has become more punishing. Is that deliberate policy?
Well, no one has laid it out that way, but that if you step back and think about it, well, what is the IRS going to do if you slash their budget? Well, they're going to have fewer people. They're going to try to do as much as they can in an automated fashion. And who's audited by computers? It's basically the poor. So you could.
Why aren't the rich audited by computers?
Because their affairs are just too complicated. I mean, basically what it is within the ITC is some computer spits out, oh, there's a risk factor here that someone's kid isn't their kid. They have databases to work from, like Social Security or whatever. And so that basically every EITC audit is either, it's usually we don't think your kids are your kids. And one thing we point out is that the households that are most likely to have kind of non-traditional setups, so grandparents taking care of kids, uncles taking care of kids, changes from year to year, that's much more likely to happen in a lower income household. And so you could, even if there's no bad faith, you can see how a computer would flag those sorts of situations more often.
And on the other side, if you think about the super wealthy, they have trusts, they have foundations, they have LLCs. They're also going to be partners in other organizations. They have overseas operations. So that's something that's not particularly susceptible to some kind of automated spitting out of something that would be generated by a computer to say this is a red flag.
Do we know when the IRS began to focus on EITC recipients?
Yeah, well, it goes back to everything else like we talked about, to Newt Gingrich and the 1994 revolution. There's actually a point in the mid-'90s where the Republican Party at that time started seizing on this issue, and it's because the IRS has reported that there's a large number of quote-unquote improper payments that go out. There's tax noncompliance up and down the income spectrum. Like, everyone is cheating at some remark. So that's stepping back. Like, this
not everyone. I'm always honest.
Right. Well, the thing is, like, compliance for people who, get a W-2 who are wages employees, like that compliance. There's studies the IRS have done about this, and it's like 99%. So yeah, it's not equal for everyone, but. It's kind of arbitrary to focus just on this one area to such a degree. But in the mid-'90s, there's actually a deal that Clinton struck with Gingrich to commit some portion of the IRS budget to just auditing EITC people. So this is something that goes back to that.
And your article notes that because of a law, EITC recipients are now more likely to have their refund held. What is that law?
So because the IRS has been slammed by Republicans for this for so long, they try to come up with solutions. And one of the solutions is, well, it would really help us if we could match the W-2 returns they get from employers with someone's tax return. And if we had a little more time to do that, so the kind of the deal that was worked out is like, we'll hold returns to mid-February, and then employers are supposed to send in the W-2s by January, and that'll allow us to make sure that people's income is what they say it is. They'll give us more chances to match that up. But the effect of that has been that when the IRS flags someone for audit, they're much less likely to have already been paid their refund. So now these audits become much more punishing because you're not just getting audited after having received the money. you never get the money. And then the IRS has to say okay before you get it, which is another difference between the rich and the poor.
And, just as in the 90s with Clinton, there was, Democratic complicity here. They didn't put up a big fight. Obama did sign that reform, quote unquote reform of the IRS and the rules around EITC. So the Democrats have certainly not made this an issue because the IRS is, or they view the IRS as politically unpopular. That's probably the correct view of it. And the poor don't have a real party behind them in Washington.
They should start hiring lobbyists.
They should, yeah. Spend that $2,000 EITC on a lobbyist or two.
My guests are Paul Keil and Jesse Eisinger. What got you even onto this story? Was it Natasha Smith or somebody at the IRS alert you to it?
We were looking for Trump's tax returns and came up with an IRS story. I mean, at the beginning of the year, Paul and I ProPublica was really concentrating on looking at the Trump administration. And the idea was that a lot of the news coverage was focusing on the White House and the chaos and the palace machinations. And what we wanted to do is look at how the policies were affecting people and what was actually going on within the administration, within the agencies. Because, in fact, this is an extremely efficient administration below the surface. And the chaos belies a bunch of very smart, able people at the agencies who are effectively pushing their agenda. And we wanted to understand what that was. And we thought that the IRS was an obvious place to start looking. And if somebody happened to put, Trump's tax returns in a manila envelope and slip under our door, we would be very happy.
We're still open to that.
Yes. Send BIA listeners, if you have them, send them our way.
But there have been a lot of complaints about the forgotten middle class. So the middle class gets a pass on this to some degree, doesn't it? Because the more money the taxpayer makes, the more likely they're to be audited. And yet you write that EITC recipients whose typical annual income is under $20,000 are the exception.
Like I said, well, for the middle class, if you're like someone who earns like $50,000 a year, you're out of range of getting the earned income tax credit. You get your income through your wages. Your wages are separately reported by your employer to the IRS. Like I said, there's been studies. There's basically no non-compliance among people who have wage income. There's not really a way for them to cheat on or rely to the IRS about what money they're getting because everything is being separately reported. The big area where there's non-compliance are people who run their own businesses and are self-employed. Those are forms of income often that are not as much reported.
Yeah, it's reported and withheld, of course.
Right. Yes.
So the government gets the money every time you have a paycheck, and so it's hard. You can't get it back from them.
Is there similar pressure to address more costly problem areas like tax evasion by business owners? Didn't the American Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, I think that's what the Trump tax cut is called, give a pass-through deduction to small businesses?
Yeah, so this is already an area that's hard to audit, and they made it much more attractive to do this. So now everyone, that's one of the big discussions. Jesse and I have been to tax conferences with a bunch of attorneys, and they're all trying to carve up these rules, like who's going to get the cut, who's not, and there's all sorts of incentive to form yourself as a pass-through if you weren't before, and they're just very hard things to audit. So like we said, to audit the rich is difficult. It takes skilled auditors to do that. They're down a third already, and now they're having to enforce a law that adds a lot more tricks to the people they're trying to go after.
Yeah, we don't get paid enough to go to those conferences. We should get extra combat pay for that.
You should get a tax deduction.
Exactly. So the IRS did recognize that it had a problem with auditing the super wealthy around the same time of right before the budget cuts, around 2010, and they formed a SWAT team to go after the super wealthy, and then it fell terrible victim to the budget cuts. and so they were aiming to have 250 auditors, and they ended up with fewer than 100.
The reason I asked about the middle class before, in 2017, weren't EITC recipients audited at twice the rate of taxpayers with incomes between $200,000 and $500,000? Only households with incomes above $1 million were examined at significantly higher rates.
Right. So that's the point at which you have people who have their own businesses, and so I mean the IRS does, particularly actually during the Obama administration, they did start to try to really increase the audit rate for the very wealthiest. But like Jesse said, this effort started just as their budget started getting slashed.
And the IRS audits are for families claiming EITC is 36%
of all the audits they do.
audits?
Yeah, like I said, it's a massive.
Over 1/3.
Yeah,
Right.
Of going after poor people.
Right.
According to a CNBC analysis of IRS data, large corporations have been especially spared, and, quote, its appetite for imposing fines or seizing assets has also declined. Is this because corporations and wealthy people can hire lawyers to represent them, which means more work for the IRS?
Well, actually, auditing is good for the tax professionals who represent corporations. They would like more auditing. So this is actually bad for the kind of the remora class of suckerfish who live off of regulations and corporations in D.C. But it's very good for corporations. The audit rate of corporations has collapsed. The collections from those audits have collapsed. The IRS asks for less money, so they find that the IRS that corporations are dodging less in taxes than they used to because the quality of the audits has gone down. It used to be at the big companies that they would put significant numbers of people embedded at the company headquarters. So GM or GE would have 30, 50 IRS auditors there, and that those giant companies would be audited every single year. Continuously. And now that's simply not true. They have many fewer auditors. They're not audited continuously, and those audits are thinner than they used to be.
An undercover investigation by the National Consumer Law Center revealed that when EITC cheating does occur, the culprits are usually tax preparers, not the filers. Why would they encourage their clients to file bogus EITC claims? What's in it for them?
Yeah, well, they usually get paid more, so they get paid. They get a higher fee for doing the return, so they have some bad incentives. Doesn't mean every tax preparer is bad, but it's been a demonstrated problem, and it's part of the way that tax administration is done that doesn't make any sense because you can just set up a shingle. New York is one of the exceptions, but in almost every state, you can just set up shop as a tax return preparer and start taking customers the next day. There's no licensing.
You don't have to be licensed.
Right. And so the IRS has made some attempts to require them to at least take a test and then to have certain compliance checks. And then they were challenged in court, and the court basically found they didn't have the right to do that. And there is some bipartisan support for the idea that they should be able to regulate these tax preparers. But
why hasn't Congress passed a bill that would give that authority to the IRS?
Well, I mean, one interesting thing we heard is that CPAs they've expressed some opposition because I guess they like the idea that they're the licensed ones, and then if everyone is licensed, then it sort of erodes their brand. That's one idea we've heard.
They don't want people undercutting them. For offering cheaper services.
But I mean, I think most people, if they go to Jackson Hewitt or H&R Block, whatever, they're under the false impression that they are CPAs or that they're somehow qualified in some other way that they work for a place that says that they do taxes. But it's a big area where there should be more regulation, and like I said, it's one area you could effectively regulate kind of by going after sort of the node of the network of fraud where it does occur.
And this is a really important issue that Paul has raised because there's this notion that there's all this cheating with the EITC and that the poor are somehow untrustworthy and prone to lying and trying to steal from the government.
Because they want to survive.
But right, exactly. But in fact, a lot of the fraud is exploiting the poor, cheating the government by exploiting the poor and filing false returns by these sort of this class of preparers.
Didn't the Census Bureau recently estimate that the EITC and the child tax credit together boost millions of children out of poverty each year? Wouldn't that be something we'd want to promote?
Right. I mean, do
we want to keep people in poverty?
It's kind of rare to find a government program that is like kind of universally lauded by economists, and this is one of them. So yeah, it's more than Social Security, more than food stamps. It's bringing kids out of poverty.
Your article quotes Natasha Smith as saying, "All I did was answer a question on TurboTax." That's what got her in trouble? What did she mean by that?
Well, we included that detail to show that she actually didn't go to a return preparer. She's someone who I think, like I said, there's not really the risk factors that are there. I mean, if you talk to IRS people, the typical fraudulent case they talk about is someone who went to a return preparer and either they're claiming kids that aren't theirs or they're making up. They claim to have their own business and they make just the right amount of income to get the maximum credit. And those are the sorts of risk flags that the IRS looks for. But she's an example of someone who's, was just answering the questions. And she sent me her return. I looked at it. There's nothing there that seems particularly fishy. So
some filers might claim the EITC when they shouldn't. But you also say about a fifth of eligible taxpayers don't seek the EITC, and almost a quarter of the $74 billion paid out this year was issued improperly.
Right. So there's both sides. So the people who are not claiming it, typically people who are not even filing, they're low-income people who think that maybe I don't need to file because what's in it for me? And they actually end up hurting themselves because there's withheld tax that they will get back. In addition, they'll probably qualify for this, but people, don't know about it, so they don't file their taxes. And then, so on the flip side is this issue of, okay, well, there's supposedly these payments going out to the wrong people. And so the point that's generally made about that, and like there's been a lot of complicated studies of it, is first, it's enormously complex. The policy is trying to pick and choose who qualifies and who doesn't. So you have situations where someone is supporting a child. So like, for instance, you have a situation where there's a divorced couple and the father is paying child support. That person can claim the child as a dependent on their taxes, but it can't be an EITC kid. And so if you claim the EITC, that's quote unquote fraud, or that's an improper payment, when you could very justly think that you qualify when maybe you don't. And the way to fix that is just to make it simpler. There's a million ways to make it so much simpler.
The IRS acknowledges the primary cause of improper claims is not fraud, but the law itself. That the law may be too complex, too easy for people to think they're eligible when they're not. What kind of complexity are we talking about here? Especially when we're also talking about people who are less likely to be, in many cases, highly educated.
Right. I mean, so it's the kid has to have lived at your address for the tax year in question for more than 6 months of the year. If there's a divorce, that's a complication. Is like, well, was it more than 6 months living with you or with the father? And then so those are the sorts of complexities that arise. People often think, well, if I can claim this kid as a dependent, why can't I claim them as an EITC qualifying child?
And then there are other complications. For example, grandparents raising grandchildren, things like that.
Right. So people shift during the year, and maybe they had the kid for 5 months and they think they qualify when in fact and this is kind of the bigger issue that we should probably talk about is the IRS is concluding that there's a lot of improper payments based on kind of audits that they do. But you have a class of people who often are not represented by an attorney. And so maybe they really do qualify, but they don't know how to, present their case to the IRS in a way to find the documentation. Maybe they can't even get the documentation. So I think there's definitely some overstatement, and there's been other experts who've said this, just because people are getting steamrolled by the audit and they're not being able to defend themselves adequately.
My guests are Paul Keil and Jesse Eisinger, whose article, Who's More Likely to Be Audited? A Person Making $20,000 or Someone Making $400,000, was published by ProPublica last month. This is Leonard Lopate at Large on WBAI, New York 99.5 FM.
Yeah, the larger point here is that we make these enormous efforts to design our social policy with a bunch of rules to have certain people qualify and certain people not qualify. Keynes said we could just bury money in holes and have people dig it up, to relieve the Great Depression, and it's very efficient money going out. It doesn't really matter for the economy that some of it is quote unquote fraudulent or some of it goes to the wrong people, because it's not going to the super wealthy people who are just not going to spend it. All this money is getting spent. It's all going back into the economy. It's helping people. We really should be not very concerned about where the money is going, except when the poor are being exploited by preparers. But for the vast majority of the money, it's better to be getting out to the poor in the system, and we should not sweat the details on this kind of stuff.
Well, you mentioned the Great Depression, but isn't it interesting that so many of the rules that we're talking about here were enacted right after the Great Recession of 2008? Is there any connection between the two?
Well, I don't know about connection, but there was certainly a compromise that the Obama administration did to try to placate the Republican Congress by instituting all sorts of austerity measures, for one. And the other was to kind of be extremely stingy on housing relief after the enormous housing crash, which Paul knows about better than almost any reporter in the country, since he covered that so well in those years. And those were two enormous political and economic democratic mistakes that the Obama administration did, I think.
Well, you shared a Pulitzer Prize for your reporting on unquestionable Wall Street practices that helped make the 2008 financial crisis the worst since the Great Depression.
Yeah.
Totally unlinked to what we're discussing here?
Sure. Well, I don't know if there's a link to the IRS and the EITC, but, so the financial crisis
I'm thinking tax policy in general.
Yeah, well, so the financial crisis was a crisis that was caused by Wall Street, which forced loans on people. And the narrative, although I think it's been debunked now, is that somehow there's an enormous amount of fraud by people walking in to banks and mortgage companies and demanding loans that they couldn't repay. But of course, nobody gets a loan from a bank that he or she can't repay without the bank willingly offering it. And the banks and mortgage companies were willingly offering it because Wall Street could bundle them into securities and sell them off. And there's this boon of financialization, a boon of people with excess capital, and a lot of sheltering of income in tax havens and corporations shifting income to low tax countries around the world. So there was a boom of kind of tax cheating and tax avoidance from the wealthy and corporations, and Wall Street financialization, and that kind of all led into the financial crisis.
If part of the problem is the complicated tax code, which not everyone understands, wouldn't it be in Congress's best interest to enact new laws that would make it easier for filers to understand?
Yeah.
Has anybody suggested that?
Well, so Senator Sherrod Brown from Ohio, who is mulling running for president and is, generally seen as a progressive within the party, one of his major kind of anti-poverty proposals is to expand the ITC. Democrats love the ITC, so there's often some model of expanded aid. And what I think he would do and a lot of people would do was expand it so it's not just for people who have children. It also goes to people who don't have children, because right now you can qualify if you don't have any kids, but it's very little money compared to how much you get if you have a kid. So there's Democrats who talk about expanding it. The problem is that simplifying it usually makes it more expensive, and that you lose. Republicans don't want to expand the program, basically, is what it comes down to.
And Republicans have been talking about simplifying the tax code for a long time, and on that principle, they're probably right. They've talked about a flat tax, which would, not be a progressive tax, and that's probably bad policy. But when they had the chance in the first year of the Trump administration to simplify the tax code. Instead, what they did was rush out a tax overhaul that layered in enormous number of complications and extremely arbitrary complications. So if you're an architect, you're exempt, but if you're a dentist, self-employed dentist, you're not. And those kind of completely ludicrous things that tax lawyers now don't fully understand and can't quite come up with the rationale for, and they don't have a rationale. So they lowered the corporate tax rate, which, there's some argument for having lowered it, although probably they lowered it too far. But then they layered in all these complexities about offshore income and partnerships and pass-throughs and other things like that. So this was nothing resembling close to as tax simplification.
Taxpayer advocates say that the IRS makes the situation needlessly worse because all audit notifications are sent via letter. Letters that are difficult to understand.
Right. So these are EOTC people who are audited. It's like the people who are audited by machines, essentially. I've seen these letters. If you read the entire thing, one thing that really strikes me is there is help you can get. So there's something called a low-income tax clinic that people should look up if they're in a situation. Local legal aid organizations sometimes attached to a law school where you can go and get free legal help. Like in the letter, it's usually way down there. So,
and some people didn't even understand that they were under audit.
Right. So the taxpayer advocate, which is this kind of ombudsman office within the IRS, this has been one of her big issues, and that's another organization that can help people if they're faced with these audits. And she's made this point a million times, basically, that people don't know what's happening. If they do know what's happening, they don't necessarily know what to do or how to do it in the most effective way.
Do you think things will change a bit now that the composition of the Congress has changed, or is it just going to be a matter of the House saying one thing and the Senate saying something else, and the President saying a third thing?
Right, yeah. Yeah, I
don't your guess is as good as ours, but the House.
I know. I hate to ask people to predict the future.
Yeah, the House controls the budget strings, and of course the House is under control of the Democrats now. And there's been some belated recognition now that the IRS has been way too hampered by budget cuts and headcount reduction. We didn't get into this yet, but the number
have very little time, so say it now.
So the number of auditors is back down to where it was in 1953. When the economy was a seventh of the size it is today, and the population was half. So,
and the top tax rate was something like 90%. Wasn't it?
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
It was a lot simpler.
So you could see the Democrats raising the budget for the IRS. I would not be surprised.
But whether Trump would sign it is another. I don't know. Right now the government's shut down. So
right at this point, there's nothing working at all.
Can people still access the article? Who's more likely to be audited? A person making $20,000 or someone making $400,000? Is ProPublica still have it online?
I think if you Google it, it'll come up. I don't know if it's on our front page anymore. But and we also have an associated story that's how the IRS was gutted. That gives kind of the full history of this and kind of goes in more in depth in other areas of the IRS that have been affected.
Thank you both so much for being on our show. We've been talking with Paul Keil and Jesse Eisinger. And that does bring us to the end of today's show. My great thanks to Jesse Eisinger and Paul Keil, to Susie Stultz, who produced this segment, to Reggie Johnson, who was at the audio controls, to my executive producer, Jesse Lent, who makes things run smoothly. Lopate at Large comes to you on Saturdays at 4 and Tuesdays at noon. You can subscribe to Leonard Lopate at Large podcast on iTunes and by clicking on Robin Hood Radio's archive program site, which is robinhoodradio.com. You can also check out Leonard Lopate at Large Facebook page. We hope to see you next week.